Melbourne. It's wonderful seeing so many of you here today. I have the privilege of traveling around the world this month to all of the different Effective Altruism conferences. And it's particularly exciting for me to see on the absolute other side of the world from where I live in Oxford, such a large and talented group of people so enthusiastic about answering the sorts of questions we're here to discuss today. So thank you all for being here, and thanks as well to the organizing team for putting on such a fantastic talk. So I'm going to be talking about why and how to prioritize. The why question is a little bit easier, and that's the main thing I'll be addressing over the course of this talk. The how is far more complicated, and I'll give you hopefully some tantalizing hints in that direction, but I'm largely going to leave you with some resources to go off and learn more about that yourself, because there's no way I can cover that over the course of a talk that's just half an hour. So Kerry mentioned at the start of this conference that effective altruism really has two parts. The first is figuring out how to do the most good, and the second is doing it. So this talk is going to be discussing the first part. Prioritization is essentially the question of figuring out how to do the most good. Now, this may seem like an obvious place to begin in your journey to doing as much good as possible, but it wasn't always the obvious place to begin, at least not for me. So this is me, age 17, when I started going about trying to make the world a better place. And I wanted to do a project, and some friends suggested to me that I work on HIV/AIDS. So I decided to run a fundraiser and raised several £1,000s. And then at the end of it, it came time to distribute the funds. And I used the very high-tech method of asking the first person I met what charity I should donate to, and then following their advice. They weren't an expert. And so, as you can see, I've picked the first cause that was suggested to me and the first charity that was suggested to me within this cause. And hopefully over the course of this talk, I will convince you that this is a very poor methodology for choosing where to donate and what sorts of problems to work on. But in order to do that, we have to dive into the data. So let's do that and discuss why we should prioritize. So here we have a graph. Across the top here is the number of additional years of healthy life that you can generate from a £1,000 donation. Okay? So up here you've got, this is no additional years of healthy life, 1 additional year of healthy life, 2 additional years of healthy life per £1,000 that you're spending on this intervention. And so if I had given this money to treating Kaposi's sarcoma, which is a rare form of AIDS, you can see here the sort of impact I would have been having, versus if I donated this money to fund antiretroviral therapies. Simply switching from one thing to another, you're getting more than a factor of 10 in terms of the increase in the amount of impact you can have. And so, given my methodology, or just the simple methodology of going with what sounds good, I would have no real sense as to which of these two is going to be the better option to go with. And yet one of them is going to allow me to do 10 times more impact with my donation than the other. And so it's just really important that we do dive in and look at this data. But we shouldn't stop here. In fact, we can zoom out a bit and introduce another intervention, preventing transmission during pregnancy. And again, you've got more than a factor of 4 in terms of the increase in impact here. We can go further again, zoom out again. Distributing condoms, preventing people from getting HIV/AIDS in the first place. Again, you've got a factor of 2 here. And now this Kaposi's sarcoma line is looking pretty small. Can zoom out again even further and look at educating high-risk groups, so educating sex workers, particularly who work in transportation hubs. Again, another factor of 2 going on here. And so by this point, you can't even see this line for Kaposi's sarcoma. And antiretroviral therapy, the one that we were initially excited about, is looking pretty bad in retrospect. And so what you can see here is by diving into this data and really analyzing what is going to allow you to have more impact, you can get huge differences in terms of your effectiveness. But why should we purely limit ourselves to HIV/AIDS? Ultimately, what we care about is improving people's lives overall. So even just to stick within things we can measure with this metric of DALYs per £1,000, we can broaden our interest to look at global health more broadly and plot the several hundred interventions in DCP2. This is one of the best sources for data on this information. And I should stress that these numbers have huge error bars on them, and that there's plenty of debate about every single one of these data points. And but that the broad trend of this is really what I'm trying to get across in this talk. Just that some things are just far better than others. And so we had some fun debate last night about some of the specifics of some of the data points on this graph and some of the subsequent ones that I'll be showing you. But I think that what is clear is that the broad trend still applies, that if you focus on the very best things, you're going to be doing far, far better than if you just pick something at random. And oftentimes 10 times or even 100 times better than picking something at random. And so you really do need to go into the depth and do the analysis to figure out what things really work. So hopefully I've indicated to you that within global health at least, there is some decent evidence for this sort of distribution in terms of the effectiveness of different interventions. But what about in other cause areas? So we can look at a question like, how can we boost school attendance? And just picking a few different results from, this is now from the Joint Poverty Action Lab, you can see some things that sound very appealing. Menstrual cups for teenage girls in Nepal, actually having no significant impact, no statistically significant impact on boosting school education and in terms of additional years in school. And then other things seeming to do a lot better. But again, we can zoom out and look at some of the very best interventions that have been recorded in the literature for tackling this problem. And again, simply just sending children home with a letter to their parents explaining how much their long-term income is going to be boosted by making sure that they don't skip days at school and so that making sure they stay in school long enough. You can be getting sort of 13 additional years of school for just £100. Now, again, there'll be debates over the exact numbers here and whether this can be applied to other countries. Probably it can't, at least not this well. But this gives you a sense that there are things you can do that are significantly more impactful than the things that you might guess at first to do, and even the things which sound good but actually aren't really having very much impact at all. So I've showed you within education. Let's go on to another cause. Peter mentioned that I used to work with the president of the Maldives trying to help figure out how to avoid his country going underwater. A particularly challenging problem given that the average height above the maximum height above sea level is 1.2 meters. Sorry, average height above sea level, 1.2 meters, which is well within the projections of sea level rise over the coming century. And so this is something that I used to get quite worried about. And so my mother used to live in Naples, which is sort of the other side of Europe from me. And I wanted to go visit her quite frequently. And instead of flying, I worried about the carbon emissions. I would shell out a lot of money for an expensive train ticket to go and see her. And this seemed all very good and well. I could save about 600 kilograms of carbon dioxide emissions for every £100 of additional money that I spent on train fares rather than plane fares. And it seemed like I was getting a pretty good deal until I considered what else I could have been spending the money on. So I should emphasize that these figures are very rough and ready. I put these together just for the purposes of this talk to give you an indication that these sorts of distributions exist in other cause areas. But I wouldn't trust any of these numbers. I've taken them all at face value from different places and different sources. But again, you can see that funding sort of friends of mine's campaigns or efforts to encourage vegetarianism, I'm just doing way, way better than if I'd taken the train rather than the plane to visit my mum. And then again, if you go out there and look for the very best thing you can be working on, something that I got quite excited about, you can see we can zoom out pretty far here. This is offsetting HFCs. These are a specific type of greenhouse gas that are often 1,000 times more potent in terms of their impact on global warming compared to carbon dioxide. And the challenge is that these are only emitted by about 40 different factories in the world. And so it's actually pretty hard to reduce those emissions. You need a lot of capital to do it. But if we could, then this would be the sort of cost effectiveness that the European Union reckons that we'd be getting by doing that. In fact, it's so cheap that they haven't been included in global carbon markets because they would distort the price too heavily. So they've explicitly ruled these out because it's just too good an intervention. So hopefully I've given you an indication at least that the very best things are just a lot better than the sorts of things that sound good and the sorts of things that you would pick simply by going with your gut or without diving into the data here. And so hopefully I've persuaded you at least why we want to be thinking about prioritization. So then the harder question to address in all of this is how to prioritize. And again, I'm not going to go into a lot of depth here. I'll just give you some sort of initial thoughts and point you off in the right direction to some useful resources, and then we can have some Q&A at the end, hopefully. But when I think about prioritizing, I think of it in sort of 3 different levels. So first, you've got this question of what cause area should I be choosing? Is it animal welfare? Is it factory farming or global poverty or existential risk? Kerry threw a whole bunch of different causes up in his talk earlier today. Then once you've chosen a cause area, then you need to pick an intervention from within that cause area. So, for example, in the case of global health, is it deworming? Is it distributing malarial bed nets? Is it iodine fortification? And then once you've done that, then you've got to choose your organization from within that intervention. So, for example, within deworming, do you go with Schistosomiasis Control Initiative? Do you go with Deworm the World? And this is a whole series of questions that you need to be asking when deciding which thing to be working on. This can be difficult. And so we can think of this as a way of ruling out our options. So if these blue dots are all of the different organizations we could be working for, then you can class them into cause areas and then into intervention types and allow this to help inform your thinking about which of these areas you want to be going for. And so I'm going to just use this as a sort of conceptual framework going forwards for some maths on the next slide. Don't worry if the math seems a little bit intense. This is more just to give you an indication of what I think is an interesting way to think about this problem. So what we can do is factor, sorry for those of you on this side who can't see this. This says effectiveness of an organization is basically factored into 3 components here. So you've got the effectiveness of the organization given the intervention, the effectiveness of the intervention given the cause area, and then the effectiveness of the area overall. And so what we've done here is we've broken down the effectiveness into these sort of 3 subcomponents for these 3 different areas that I was talking about earlier. And then you can try and plot this in 3 dimensions here. And because these multiply together, what we really care about is the volume of this cuboid here, represented by the effectiveness of the 3 different components that we're looking at. And so what this allows us to do is start to compare between different organizations, different things that we could be donating to, different things we could be working on. And what you see here is that you can have an organization that's very well run within its intervention, and its intervention is pretty good within its cause area, but it's just not working in that useful of a cause area. And so overall, it can have much less impact here, represented by much less volume, compared to an intervention which is working in a very good area, but is perhaps slightly less well run and slightly less of a good intervention. And so what this shows you is that you really want to be thinking about all 3 of these terms and multiplying them together. And often it's this sort of area which is going to be doing a fair bit of the work, sometimes. But really it's the multiple of the 3 which is getting you your overall effectiveness of the thing you're working on. So we've talked about sort of choosing a cause area, choosing an intervention, and choosing an organization from within that. But how do you do that? This is ultimately what the big question is here, and how you go about answering this is complicated. But I'm going to throw up a few different principles and different things you might want to look at within each of these different layers as you dive down into this. So firstly, when you're looking at a cause area, 4 things you might want to consider. First is the scale. So how important is this issue? If we were to be able to solve this issue, how big a deal would that be? So this is one nice rule of thumb that you can use. Another is neglectedness. How many people are working on this? If there's a lot of people working on an issue already, it's less likely that you're going to deliver that key insight or make that key difference if the area is just pretty crowded. This is similar to the sort of law of diminishing marginal returns. Another idea here is tractability. Are there easy things that you can put money or time into right now that you know are going to make a difference? So distributing malarial bed nets is a great example of something that's extremely tractable. We just know that if we put money in there, we're going to have a lot of impact. And then finally, crucial considerations. These are important arguments that can completely shift your opinion about which cause area you should be working on relative to another one. And so in my talk tomorrow, I'll be presenting you with a crucial consideration for why I think working on the long-run future and existential risk more generally is a really important area. And I'll be using crucial considerations in that. And so these are sort of 4 rules of thumb, or four things you want to be looking at when you're considering which cause area you want to go into. And so these are a couple of organizations. Perhaps I'm slightly biased, but I co-founded the Global Priorities Project last year to help think about this question of cause selection in more detail. They focus more on sort of the first 3. The Future of Humanity Institute, where I work now, is focused on developing crucial considerations to help us think about improving the long-run future, and essentially helping us choose cause areas within our efforts to improve the long-run future. So then within interventions, this is where you want to get into the sorts of data that I've been presenting in the rest of this talk. You want to start looking at randomized control trials, cost-effectiveness estimates. This is where a lot more work has been done in the literature, and there's a lot of data out there. And so I'd encourage you to dive into that data and look into this in more detail. There's more data in some of the more immediate things with better feedback, I should say. In some of the more long-term things, we just don't have data. We don't know, for example, how well different interventions are going to be improving, say, humanity in 100 years' time. That's just not something we can have data on. But where there is data, I'd definitely encourage you to use it. And so groups working in this sort of area, the Disease Control Priorities Project, which produced all of the data on HIV/AIDS that I showed you at the beginning, is definitely a great source to go to on this. It can be a little dense. Their latest report was 1,400 pages. You may need some background to dive into it, but I think it's definitely worth checking out. And then there's also organizations that work in between the two. So the Open Philanthropy Project is largely working on cause selection at the moment, but is sort of broadening out. And the Copenhagen Consensus Center, working between these two. Then finally, once you get down to selecting an organization, you want to think more about things like track record, transparency, the quality of the team. These are the sorts of things you want to be looking at when picking your organization. And again, you're probably familiar with some of these groups: GiveWell, Giving What We Can, Animal Charity Evaluators. These are the groups that sort of work in the space between interventions and organizations. But they've generally already picked their cause area that they're trying to work on. And so what you'll notice here is that there is no organization actually working on this whole picture, trying to work on all 3 levels simultaneously. The Open Philanthropy Project is trying to go in that direction. They're not there yet. But what this really indicates to me is this is actually an incredibly hard problem. Having enough knowledge to work within all of these 3 areas is very difficult. I consider myself someone who cares a lot about this, and I've dived into the data in a whole bunch of these different levels. But even for me, I basically don't consider myself to know enough about choosing an intervention or choosing an organization to do more than just trust what these guys say. And so I'll try and do sort of novel work in this area, but ultimately I'm just going to be trusting these guys. And so what I'd really encourage you to do is go to these organizations and talk to these people and use their knowledge that they've accumulated from working on this to guide your thoughts on this. The other thing to say, though, is that this is a young area, and people have only really been trying to do prioritization in this way for sort of a couple decades, really, 2 or 3 decades. It depends quite how you define it. But there's slowly more and more of an academic focus on this. And so it may be that this is something that you can also contribute to. And I would encourage you to feed into the discussions that are going on online on this. And there's a lot of places out there where you can contribute to the discussions on this. And so this is really a key area and a key question within effective altruism, is figuring out how to prioritize between the different things we can be doing. So hopefully I've given you a bit of a sense of why we should be prioritizing. I've shown you that some things we can work on are far more effective than others. I probably haven't given you very much of a sense of how to prioritize, but I've given you hopefully some resources you can go on to learn more about that. So prioritization is challenging. There's a lot of data out there, and sifting through it is difficult. But there is a growing body of experts working on this problem, and I'd encourage you to turn to them and use the resources that they're making available. Finally, I'd encourage you to take prioritization seriously. Change your mind. Look for information that will change your mind in all of this. And then when you've changed your mind, change your actions. Go work and donate for the organizations that are allowing you to have the most impact. And so finally, I guess I'd want to leave you with one final resource. So this is William McCaskill's book, published this month. This goes into this question of how do we prioritize in a lot more detail. Effectively, the whole book is really on that question, is how do we pick the best things to be working on. And in that, every single claim he makes is referenced in the back, and you can start to dive into a whole bunch of sources here. And he gives you with all sorts of additional resources at the end to learn more about this. So I'd really encourage you, if you're interested in trying to figure out how to do the most good, to pick up a copy of Will's book and devour it. There's a lot in there that I'd encourage you to check out. So hopefully I've given you a sense of why to prioritize. I've given you some very rough indications in the direction of how to prioritize and given you some resources to go off and do that. But I'd love to talk more about this over the course of the weekend. So please do come grab me, and we can dive into debate and discussion about some of the specifics and some of the broad overall questions. This is really something that requires some depth to go into and some more time. So do grab me over the course. But I think that we do have a few minutes now for Q&A if people have time.
So what cause are you currently prioritising?
Great question. So I've seen a few hands shoot up. I might take a few at once and then answer them in swathes, if that's all right.
So it sounds like you've managed to build a bit of influence and talk to some pretty important people in the G8. Do you have any tips on how you actually got to that position, how you were able to be invited to things like talking to the G8?
Sure. So which cause area do I work on? Personally, the two cause areas that I'm most excited about is movement building. So the reason for this is that right now, cause prioritization is a relatively new field, and I don't have a sense for what we're going to end up thinking is most important. I have some guesses, but the nice thing about movement building is that you're building a team of people globally who can work on whatever it turns out to be as most important. And so as our priorities shift and our understanding grows, then people and the resources that they control can then move towards the most important things. And so because this is a relatively young field, I think that's a useful one to go to. I will take a punt though, and my guess is that we do have an incredible opportunity to improve the long-run future of humanity as well, and in particular with making sure that we avoid a bunch of the risks that are coming online over the coming century, in particular with emerging technologies that haven't yet been developed but pose significant risks for humanity over the coming century. This is something I'll be talking a bit more about tomorrow, and I can go into more detail on then. But I'll leave that as a tantalizing hint in that direction to talk to me about this more later or listen to my talk tomorrow. On the question of how to influence policymakers, and how I got into that sort of position. The main thing that I did, I guess there was like a few different things. One was just sort of being quite relentless and just essentially hassling people to ensure that I was in the positions that I would be able to talk to the right people. And then once I was in those positions, making sure that I really had a decent understanding of the sorts of things I was trying to talk to them about, so that I was at least providing them with some value, so then they come back and talk to you again. Ultimately, talking to policymakers is pointless unless you unless you know quite a bit of stuff. They're going to think that you are not a useful person to talk to. Even if you think you have sort of this one key insight that they should really be doing, they tend not to trust you unless you have a broader swath of knowledge in a bunch of similar areas, because then they can figure out whether you seem like a smart person in general or if you're just a crank that sort of just comes to them with this one thing. So I'd encourage you to sort of get a deep and broad knowledge in whatever area it is that you want to be going and talking to policymakers about. Is probably the most useful thing. And then the other thing I just mentioned briefly is like starting to build a profile and starting to say things online in particular is like a great place to go for this. So when I was doing my master's, I co-founded a climate policy think tank, which was basically a glorified word for a website where I and a bunch of friends wrote a bunch of stuff. But we were like pretty relentless about writing this stuff. And before long, we became known as one of the most influential climate policy websites on the internet, and found that sort of policymakers and policy wonks would come and read our stuff and would end up sort of taking our advice on some of the things that we were suggesting. But part of it is just being persistent and having that knowledge to dive in there.
It feels like a lot of discussion's been around the billions of dollars tied up that governments can decide on. But that's sort of world one, where causes are quite similar. Then there's the world two, where there's radical difference in the causes. And so with much less money that's not tied to established incentives, established things, you can potentially have a much bigger effect. You're someone that's straddled both of those. How, like, it sounds like a lot of people in the audience are trying to decide, do you try and guide the billions, or do you try and make very targeted, very effective dollars on something that's not tied to existing incentives and causes and things that are too bundled up? How do you navigate that? Do you have a common metric that lets you straddle those two and make your call?
Great question. Yeah.
How do you pick the right metric for some of these interventions, and also how do you compare metrics? Like, how does one trade off school attendance years per £100 spent versus quality adjusted life years per £100 spent?
Great. Yeah. So I'll address this one first. The quick answer is that we don't know how, unfortunately. And in terms of picking metrics, we also don't really know how to do that. The best that we can do is pick something that we think is closely aligned to what it is that we're valuing in this area. And looking at whether that metric also captures some of the, whether that metric correlates with some of the other similar effects that we want to happen but aren't captured by that metric. If that makes any sense. Some metrics, if you maximize for that metric, you end up with a bunch of negative side effects. Other metrics, if you maximize for that metric, you end up with sort of more positive side effects. And so that's sort of one of the things you want to be thinking about in this as well. But the quick answer is that we don't know how. And this is a thing that I hope we start to have more of a clue about over the coming decade as more and more people focus on the question of cause prioritization. On this question of should we be guiding governments or should we be guiding individuals, and sort of big money versus but poorly targeted versus small money but more specifically targeted, for me, the big change in my views on this actually came from seeing this graph. No, this one here. So if you are, essentially, government funds are very tied up and they're hard to move about. And so generally speaking, when you try and move them, they don't go where you've wanted them to move. They'll go to something sort of vaguely in that direction, but it's not always quite the thing you want. And so what this means is that you're not likely to hit this very best thing. You're likely to end up sort of, somewhere else, maybe nearby, maybe not. Whereas once you can have a better sense of targeting that money, then it's actually a lot easier to target these very, very best things. And so this is actually probably the biggest component that's made me shift away from doing more government-focused work onto more advising philanthropists and major donors, because I can give them this advice and they can actually go spend it on exactly the thing that we've been recommending. And because the difference between exactly the thing and something pretty close by is often sort of a factor of 10, that I feel like that allows you to get more impact. The caveat to this is that on an area like reducing the chance of human extinction, we don't really know what to do. We have no idea what the things out here are, and we have no idea what the things down here are. And so in expectation, it just looks more like a blur. And so in situations like this, I think it's a bit more useful to work with governments when you just don't really have as much of a clue what's going on, because you have less opportunity to divert funds to exactly the very best thing, if that makes sense. Thanks a lot.